Hi there. Good morning, everybody. Thanks. I want to welcome you to day 2 of exploring human dignity in turbulent times. And I want to note for those that weren't here for the first day, the concept of dignity has a deep ethical component, and it also traverses political divides. And for that reason, we've kind of chosen to focus on it. So yesterday we explored interreligious frameworks, immigration policy, gender and sexuality, and climate change. Today we turn our attention to health and wellness in a broad sense, focusing on hunger, healthcare access, and emerging technologies. We hope to foster conversations and bring new ideas for the purpose of coming together and coalition building down the line. Finally, our hope is that this convening contributes to helping us meet the challenges of the day. There are many people from JTS who came together to make this event possible. I'd especially like to thank our Chancellor Shuli Rubin Schwartz, Vice Chancellor Rabbi Gordon Tucker, Chancellor Emeritus Arnie Eisen, Provost Jeff Kress, Rabbi Joel Seltzer, Vice Chancellor for Institutional Development, Vice Chancellor Randy Michaels, Vice Chancellor and Chief Operating Officer, as well as Eli Mars, Ellie Gettinger, and Beth Meyerowitz. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rabbi Gordon Tucker.
Good morning, and my welcome to everyone as well. As Tamara just said, Dr. Newman just said, especially for those who may not have been here yesterday and are coming for the first time, a couple of other people with whom we've been working who have been essential parts of making this happen. So one of them is in the control room back there, Chris Hickey, who is playing an even additional role this morning, as you will hear, with a Zoom panelist. And Lisa Springer and Janie Schneider, our facility staff, James Esposito, Mark Hudson, and security, Dane Douglas. All of them, it really takes a village to put something like this on. In addition to the faculty members who chaired and moderated sessions, and all of our panelists and workshop chairs, and staff members who volunteered to help out, to do some ushering and helping out, and students who signed up to help as well. It's really been a large effort. But all of it fell day to day for months to Dr. Tamara Newman. So I'd like you to give thanks to her right now. So we hope that those who have been attending since yesterday and those who are still here, coming in, will yet attend these sessions, will find that they have learned a great deal from our many experts, all of whom have given of their time and expertise for this very urgent moral matter of kavod habriot, of human dignity. We hope that there will be, and perhaps already is, inspiration for everyone who is here and what you have learned to find even more ways in your life and work to uphold human dignity in this troubled world. And we hope that in speaking of this convening to others, you will convey that this is a gathering of voices of many religious faiths, not to decide one public policy over another, but rather to set what I referred to yesterday as a moral floor of human dignity, above which all sorts of democratic debates can legitimately proceed. But beneath that moral floor, there can be no justification for any public or private action to fall. There must be such a floor. There must be such a red line, and religious faith requires it. It's that simple and that urgent. Now, 2 words about the session that is about to begin. A person who will be missed on this panel is Imam Omer Bajwa, who is the director of Muslim life at Yale University. He was very much looking forward to being part of this convening and on this upcoming panel. Just a few days ago, he very regretfully informed us that a health issue, not a terribly serious one, but sufficient to make his participation unwise, it meant that he, and these are his words, needed to regretfully withdraw from the JTS panel, and he added, "I hope that you understand and that I would have wished to have joined you." So as I said, his presence and voice is missed. We wish him the best of health going forward. Widespread cancellation of flights from Chicago last evening also prevented the Reverend Adam Phillips from getting here in person. We will, however, be able to hear his contribution to this panel via Zoom, and you will see him up on that screen. So that is Dr. Billet here. She's back there. Okay, Dr. Shira Billet, I'm going to turn it over to her, she is chairing and moderating this session. She is Assistant Professor of Jewish Thought and Ethics and the Academic Director of the Hendel Center for Ethics and Justice here at JTS. Please.
All right, so now that we've reached our start time, we'll begin the panel. I'm honored to be here, to be part of a crucial conversation with our distinguished panelists, both here and on Zoom, who have so much to teach us about the important theme of today's panel. Before we turn to them, I want to offer some broad framing remarks that will hopefully lend some coherence to our discussion and also address some of the limits of what this panel can accomplish, as well as the aims that it hopes to accomplish. The theme of today's panel is hunger, displacement, and civilian suffering. These forms of human suffering and loss of dignity arise in many contexts for particular individuals, but as broad collective challenges, I think the two most salient areas for our consideration, and that we will address today, are first, poverty in general, and second, armed conflict or war. Each of these two broad categories is such a complex topic. To truly address the challenges of hunger, displacement, and suffering in each one of these contexts would, of course, require far more time than we are allotted today. To address the problem of poverty, for example, we would need to discuss root causes, structural causes, and the way poverty is intertwined with other issues, such as climate, access to healthcare, as well as intergenerational challenges associated with historical marginalization, race, ethnicity, class, etc. And to address civilian suffering in war would, of course, require a robust discussion of military ethics, the history of international law, and the particular challenges associated with specific conflicts. In both broad contexts, we would want to think about how to address entrenched challenges, for example, structural ones, that are difficult to surmount even when there is broad consensus that the problem of hunger and suffering that lies before us should be solved or addressed. And we would also want to address challenging cases where hunger and suffering become politicized, or where resolving the moral problem is at odds in some way with a political aim. We are well aware of how hunger can become entangled in military conflicts, and I know that the example of Gaza, the hunger of Israeli hostages, and of Palestinian civilians has been on the mind of so many of us in recent times. And of course, hunger becomes entangled not just in military, but in civilian politics too. And we have been seeing this here in the United States just over the past few weeks, with the entanglement of the suspension of SNAP benefits in the government shutdown, which had its own political aims on either side of the aisle. Even in the best case scenario, when a political aim is itself worthy, and the suffering entangled within it is an unintended but inevitable byproduct, arguably, questions arise about moral conflicts. That is to say, what to do when two goods are in conflict with one another, or, put more accurately, when we are faced with a set of choices that are all morally compromised. A premise of this conference is that the preservation of human dignity ought to be at the front and center of our moral consciousness at all times, even in these tough cases, and ought to always be our chief aim, even when there are very real reasons that make achieving that aim challenging. And we know from human history and from present reality that this is a perennial struggle. The daunting nature of the task can't stop us from holding ourselves responsible to work to close that gap. To paraphrase Pirkei Avot, or the ethics of the fathers, although it's not on us to complete the task, neither are we free to avoid it. And so this panel is very much the beginning of many conversations that we need to be having. Or more accurately, the continuation, because I know everyone in this room has been thinking about these issues. I'm reminded of a famous tension between two verses in Deuteronomy chapter 15, a tension that has occupied Jewish theologians, rabbis, jurists, and philosophers for 2,000 years. On the one hand, Deuteronomy 15:4 gives the moral ideal toward which our politics must aspire. There shall be no needy among you. On the other hand, in that very same chapter, Deuteronomy 15:11 gives the reality check. For the poor shall never cease from the land, and therefore you must open your hands to the needy. There is an ideal. We must work towards the ideal, and our ideal should be nothing less than the end of poverty, the end of hunger, and to extend this into the other broad category relevant to our discussion here, the end of war, the end of civilian suffering. At the same time, we live in this real, messy, broken world where challenges are entrenched, incentive structures to resolve them are complicated at best, sometimes, and at worst, for very bad reasons, almost impossible to overcome, and at other times, even for understandable reasons, difficult to overcome. We must work within this reality to find real solutions that actually help those suffering on the ground. To this end, we need to learn about the challenges and understand the histories, and that's part of what this panel hopes to begin to accomplish in terms of broad categories that we need to know about. We must form partnerships, especially across religious and political difference, over the shared aim of upholding human dignity. We must always aspire toward the ideal, which should be our guiding star, and at the same time, in actual reality, should accept along the way and should even value smaller and more imperfect wins as we continue to build the groundwork for bigger wins. Every individual who can be helped is a person with infinite value, created in the image of God. Sometimes we despair of helping individuals when that doesn't solve bigger collective problems, and that despair is wrong. Of course, at the same time, we should never think our work is done when we help a few people without succeeding in addressing bigger problems. Again, we can never let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or even the good become the enemy of the less bad, but we must always recognize where our efforts are falling short and where we must work to do more, always. In just a moment, we'll hear from three panelists who all have expertise in thinking about and working towards resolutions of big picture problems related to the themes of this panel. And they will share with us something about the history and the state of the field of their respective areas of work. From Reverend Adam Phillips, we'll learn about international aid and partnerships across difference in the United States. From Professor Menachem Rosensaft, we'll learn about the history of international law and the challenges of civilian hunger in past and present military conflicts. And from Venerable Bhikku Bodhi, we will learn about faith-based poverty relief, especially coming out of the Buddhist community. One final point before we turn to our panelists. This conversation is being hosted by the Jewish Theological Seminary in the context of interreligious partnerships with other faith-based institutions. In this context, it's worth mentioning the ways in which, for religious communities, social and political challenges become connected to theological ones. I'm reminded of the wonderful term that comes from 20th century sociology, the term sociodicy, which plays on an age-old theological term, theodicy. Theodicy refers to the question of how we can reconcile the existence of innocent suffering with the goodness and power of God. Can God be good if God allows this to happen? Sociodyssey asks a similar question about human beings. How can it be, especially with the advances in technology associated with modernity, our capacity to mass produce food, to prevent death from so many illnesses that used to be the scourge of human life and of childhood? And how can it be that we now have a capacity to connect a global community and to overcome all sorts of prejudices and differences, and yet there is still widespread poverty, death from preventable diseases, and conflicts that result in mass death and killing? Can we still believe in the goodness of humanity in light of all of this? And to combine these two questions, can we still believe in the creation of all human beings in the image of God when we see the image of God violated every day in big and small ways? While these questions are, of course, a challenge for all of us living through these dark times, I hope, and I actually believe, that the work of each of our panelists can inspire us on both counts to believing in both the goodness of God and of humanity, because each of their work is informed both by religious commitment and by a deep daily commitment to the preservation of human dignity. I'll just briefly mention the bios of each of our panelists, and then they will give a presentation in the order in which I introduce them. And then after we hear a broad presentation from each of them about their work, we'll have a second round where they speak a little bit more personally about what brings them to their work, and also sharing a text from their religious tradition that inspires them in the work they do. So our first panelist is Adam Phillips, the CEO of Interfaith America, the nation's largest bridge-building organization across campus, corporate, and civic spaces. Having spent 2 decades at the intersection of faith and public life, he previously worked at USAID in both a development and diplomatic capacity, where he oversaw development policy, new and non-traditional partnerships, as well as democracy initiatives in nearly 100 countries. An ordained minister, Adam has also led and started new congregations and led faith mobilization efforts at advocacy organizations like One and Bread for the World, amongst many other accomplishments. Menachem Rosensaft is adjunct professor of law at Cornell Law School, lecturer in law at Columbia Law School, and general counsel emeritus of the World Jewish Congress. He is the founding chairman of the International Network of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and a past president of Park Avenue Synagogue in New York City. And most recently, he's the author of the critically acclaimed Burning Psalms, Confronting Adonai After Auschwitz, and I believe we'll hear an excerpt from that work. Bhikku Bodhi is an American Buddhist monk ordained in Sri Lanka and an acclaimed teacher. He was appointed the second president of the Buddhist Publication Society and has edited and authored many publications grounded in the tradition. Also, he has translated and commented on many traditional texts, and he is the current president of the Buddhist Association of America, and for the purposes of our panel, will be sharing with us experiences in his work as the founder of the organization Buddhist Global Relief. So without further ado, we begin with Reverend Phillips.
Thank you so much, and my sincere apologies for not being there in person. There was weather, and then there was also lots of travel challenges to get there. So I'm calling from Chicago, Illinois, where I lead Interfaith America. But I'm here this morning to talk mostly about my time at USAID and to capture the U.S. Agency for International Development, which was started in 1961. It's really an honor to be with you here today, because I think that this room and others like it will be the ones to rebuild and to solve the immense challenges that have unfolded in the wake of the destruction of USAID and really shocks to the entire development sector. The history of USAID was that President John F. Kennedy created the Agency for International Development with a conviction that I think still resonates. American leadership must be expressed not only in strength, but in service, not only in power, but in partnership. JFK understood that in a post-colonial world, development was not charity, it was a stabilizing force, a way to reduce the likelihood of conflict, strengthen democratic institutions, prevent famine, and protect human dignity. Kennedy believed that peace and freedom walk together, and USAID was created to walk alongside nations building new futures. It started in November of '61, so we're in a way celebrating its anniversary on this panel to get today. From its beginning, USAID worked through trusted faith-based and community organizations. These partners were the connective tissue of local life. They understand the cultural and spiritual landscape, and faith leaders across a myriad of traditions around the world embody trust, legitimacy, and continuity. I saw this firsthand in the emergency response to COVID. I was a President Biden appointee at USAID, where I led our localization and faith-based office, as was being shared. We immediately went to work to get shots in arms, and without the trusted, tried and true partnership of faith leaders, imams, pastors, priests, we would have been sunk. And without partnerships like American Jewish World Service, World Vision, Catholic Relief Services, we would have not been able to get those shots in arms. Faith communities really were the difference maker in getting these done. But it wasn't just our administration that was doing this. President Clinton strengthened USAID's democracy work and expanded global health responses. The Clinton administration also developed an early famine warning system that modernized food aid programs so it could identify where famines were breaking out and that where we could help address those acute hunger issues before they became country-killing disasters. President George W. Bush created PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, to really truly transformed global health, HIV reduction, and his leadership on food security as well, especially during the 2008 global food crisis, remains one of the most significant bipartisan humanitarian achievements of this century. President Obama elevated USAID as one of the 3 pillars of national security. That's important to note. Obama expanded Feed the Future, which cut hunger and improved agricultural resilience across entire regions. USAID also led on displacement crises in Syria and the Horn of Africa, which are still playing out to this very day. And I want to give credit where credit is due. President Trump's first term preserved much of USAID's architecture and had unbelievable advancements when it came to concerns around food aid, refugee response, famine prevention, and of course, faith-based partnerships. Without President Trump and the administration's leadership on COVID as well, we wouldn't have been able to streamline and get these vaccines online and get them around the world. So what we were trying to do in the Biden administration was to rebuild the global health systems after the pandemic, to expand democracy protection, to strengthen climate adaptation, to double down on local partnerships. And we were making great strides in that effort under the leadership of my boss, Samantha Power. But what happened was in the early opening months of this year was an unmitigated humanitarian catastrophe. We might call it the Doge dismantling, or as the world's richest man said on a website, they threw the agency into the wood chipper. Under President Trump's second administration, the creation of the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, triggered the most sweeping rollback of American humanitarian engagement in modern history. It was shocking because this was a bipartisan effort for decades. This was not just a downsizing of AID, it was a demolition. More than 80% of USAID programs were frozen or terminated in weeks. Thousands of civil servants and humanitarian experts were forced out of jobs, forced out of their roles on the front lines of some of these incredibly concerning food and human displacement crises. Faith-based organizations were left without supply chains, partners, and famine early warning systems, as I was describing earlier, went completely dark, and refugee protection programs evaporated. Consequences have been immediate and devastating. Atul Gawande, my colleague at USAID, has recently put out Rovina's Choice. You can find this documentary online. It was also featured in a recent New Yorker article where we see the moral cost of policy collapse. Gawande describes mothers walking miles to shuttered clinics, therapeutic foods for starving children run out. One doctor in Kakuma refugee camp is responsible for something like 60,000 people. Acute malnutrition and cholera return with a vengeance. Communities already fragile tip into total catastrophe. The New Yorker article puts it starkly. The shutdown of USAID has already killed hundreds of thousands, including an enormous amount of children. When we think about lifelines and aid and development, we also have to think about policy and where our tax dollars go to work. Just months after USAID's collapse, the current administration announced a $20 billion bailout package for Argentina. So it's an interesting number, $20 billion for Argentina, which is nearly 2/3 of USAID's entire global budget, which was around 30 to 35 billion on an average year. So that single bailout for a middle income nation, not a developing nation, but a middle income nation, overshadow the entire U.S. development mission that works to feed, shelter, educate, vaccinate, and protect hundreds of millions of people. So we are living in the most severe hunger and displacement crisis since World War II. Hunger and famine, over 780 million people are food insecure, 50 million are on the brink of famine. 45% of child deaths worldwide are linked to malnutrition. USAID was the backbone of global famine prevention. Again, tried and true, bipartisan, Republican, Democrat, nonpartisan, everyone leads. Feed the Future boosted agricultural systems. Something called FuseNet, which is the famine early warning system, predicted these droughts and famines. These programs fed millions and helped not just millions survive, but live and thrive and develop those communities and those economies. So we have these systems collapsing, and there's plenty of work to do. So what do we do? I think one way we can think about it is to center faith-based and local voices. New and non-traditional partnerships was always part of the equation for us at USAID over the decades, but to enshrine that for the long haul, to really be strategic in our religious engagement, I was proud to lead something called Building Bridges and Development, the first ever religious engagement policy for the US government. This policy rested on a simple premise that development cannot succeed without engaging the religious dynamics that shape societies. The policy called for religious literacy, understanding how faith shapes trust, conflict, and cooperation. It called for principled pluralism to strengthen social cohesion across religious lines, to offer safeguards, and to really center co-creation. How do we work with local partners, including faith leaders and communities, as equal actors, not just as those in which we are giving aid to, but we're really designing sustainable programs with. I think these are crucial to seeking the peace, to seeking flourishing for communities around the world, and to address the issues at hand. So as I conclude in my kind of opening remarks here, why does this matter for us here in the United States? I had the opportunity and privilege to travel out to 14 countries while I was with USAID. And one trip was to Iraq. I was able to be both in Baghdad, the capital, and in Erbil in the north, which is often known as Iraqi Kurdistan. When I was there in 2023, I met with dozens and dozens of civil society leaders, government leaders, and they told me time and time again that the hardest work ahead was not rebuilding roads after their decimating war, but to rebuild trust. And it struck me that as we were talking with these civil society leaders, that each was representing their own community groups, Shia factions, Sunni factions, Christian, Catholic, women's groups, climate groups, youth run groups. There's even a very small but crucial religious and ethnic minority community, certainly in Kurdistan, but throughout the country. And we think too about the Yazidi faith community. I remember thinking to myself, if they could just figure out pluralism, they might be able to work together to really rebuild that trust. And when I went back to my room, I thought to myself, we have that problem here in this country. So, CEO of Interfaith America now, having worked with Interfaith America these last 2 years, we're doing our level best to figure out ways to respect, relate, and cooperate across our differences for the common good. We saw recently the SNAP cuts, or the closure of the government and the threat to SNAP. We see ongoing housing and other cuts to tried and true partnerships with faith-based programs and organizations. We've got our own work to do here domestically. So I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I think we tackle them all together, and we each carve out our own role in tackling those concerns and crises together. But I think what happens abroad also is related to what happens at home. as we rebuild trust and as we lean into this high conflict, high polarized moment. I'll leave it for there, but eager to get into the panel. Thank you.
Professor Billet, Reverend Phillips, Venerable Bodhi, Chancellor Rubin, Chancellor Emeritus Eisen, I am deeply honored to be here at the seminary, and thank you for this opportunity. In the tradition of Yiddish after dinner speakers, let me start with, as in Yiddish would be saying, Eidechel reden will ich sagen a paar Wörter, which translates as, before I speak, I want to say a few words. And I would be remiss in not acknowledging the presence of Vice Chancellor Rabbi Gordon Tucker, who is truly one of the greats in American Jewish leadership and spiritual leadership. And I'm deeply grateful to Gordon for the invitation to be here. Allow me to begin with a reality check. Goldstein, those familiar with services at Park Avenue Synagogue may notice that I've borrowed one of Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove's favorite rhetorical props. Goldstein finds the proverbial lamp while taking a stroll on the proverbial beach, rubs the lamp, and out comes the proverbial genie who grants the lucky Goldstein the proverbial wish. I'm terrified of flying, says Goldstein, but I've always wanted to see Paris. I want a highway across the Atlantic on which I can drive my car from New York to France. Are you out of your mind, replied the genie. Do you have any idea how many thousands of steel pilings, each thousands of meters deep, would be required to build a bridge over more than 3,000 miles of turbulent waters to hold up such a highway, and how many millions of tons of concrete would be needed? Can't be done, impossible, forget it. I'll grant you another wish instead. Okay then, says Goldstein, explain to me the international humanitarian law ramifications of the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. Without missing a beat, the genie asks, do you want your highway to have 2 lanes of 4? I've been tasked with addressing hunger and starvation as a war crime in relation to international law and other relevant contexts, and to consider, in about 15 minutes, the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza through the lens of interreligious ethics and responsibility, as well as international law, end quote. Good luck with that, but here goes anyway. International humanitarian law, often referred to more succinctly as IHL, is essentially a post-World War II phenomenon. Prior to that time, civilian populations were afforded few, if any, protection in wartime. On the contrary, as UCLA professor David Marcus noted in a 2003 article on famine crimes in international law, and I'm quoting, historically, the laws of war permitted the starvation of civilians as a means of forcing a surrender. The Lieber Code, drafted at President Lincoln's behest, recognized that, quote, war is not carried on by armed alone, and stated that, again, quote, it is lawful to starve the hostile belligerent, armed or unarmed, so that it leads to the speediest subjection of the enemy, end quote. Vague assurances in the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 that civilians under military occupation by a foreign power would remain under the protection and the rule of the law of nations were essentially toothless. In the wake of the horrors and atrocities of World War II, the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war, constituted the first comprehensive initiative to provide broad-based legal protections for civilians caught up in maelstroms of war. Articles 23 and 55 of this convention are relevant to today's discussion. Article 23 provides that, and I quote, each high contracting party shall allow the free passage of all consignments of medical and hospital stores and object necessary for religious worship intended only for civilians of another high contracting party, even if the latter is its adversary. It shall likewise permit the free passage of all consignments of essential foodstuffs, clothing, and tonics intended for children under 15, expectant mothers, and maternity cases. However, this requirement to provide free passage of certain humanitarian aid is not absolute and is subject to the condition that there are no serious reasons for fearing that the consignments may be diverted from their destination, that the control may not be effective, or that a definite advantage may accrue to the military efforts or economy of the enemy through the substitution of the above-mentioned consignments. Under Article 23, the military power that is allowing humanitarian aid to be brought into an occupied territory has the right to make sure that this aid reaches its intended recipient and is not misappropriated by occupied non-civilians. Article 55, in turn, provides that to the fullest extent possible, the occupying power has a duty of ensuring the food and medical supplies of the population. Again, requiring that necessary food and medical stores be brought in. And then in 1977, two protocols to the Geneva Convention explicitly prohibited starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. While neither Israel nor the US has ratified these protocols, they have become part of international humanitarian law. It is against this legal backdrop that we should consider the human and humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza as it evolved over the almost precisely 2 years of the Israel-Hamas war. The savagery of the Hamas terrorist bloodbath on October 7, 2023, and Hamas's violent abduction that day of over 200 hostages into Gaza sparked a legitimate but fierce, some have argued disproportionately fierce, military reaction on Israel's part that resulted in the devastation that is Gaza today. But the often legitimate criticisms of the way Israel waged its military campaign against Hamas do not alter the fundamental fact that the military campaign itself, whose goal was to eliminate Hamas as an existential threat to Israel, was in and of itself legitimate. From the get-go, Israel's military strategy was predicated on a blockade of Gaza, a siege, if you will. This was neither unprecedented nor unexpected. Sieges have been part of military operations since organized groups or entities have resorted to warfare as a means of achieving military or political objectives. Sieges as such have not been and are not prohibited under international law, including international humanitarian law. The points of legal, moral, and political contention were and are over how Israel's blockade of Gaza was implemented. Quote, "I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel, everything is closed," declared Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on October 9, 2023, at the outbreak of the war. This ill-advised statement, together with Gallant's equally coarse and unseemly observation that we are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly, would provide fodder for those who accuse Israel of committing war crimes and worse. An important factor to bear in mind is that international law, including IHL, distinguishes between combatants and non-combatants. As we have seen, IHL requires a military force that is laying siege to a territory to ensure that the civilian, that is to say, the non-combatant population of that territory, does not starve, and it must allow food and other humanitarian aid to reach those non-combatant civilians. At the same time, however, the besieging power is allowed to take steps to try to prevent the combatants under siege from appropriating or otherwise benefiting from such humanitarian aid. As said, while a legitimate purpose of Israel's blockade of Gaza was to defeat Hamas, Israel was under an obligation to allow food and medical supplies to be brought into Gaza for non-combatant civilian populations. The problem inherent in this scenario was that Israel also had every right to prevent Hamas from intercepting the humanitarian aid in question. And the line between Hamas militants and Palestinian civilians unaffiliated with Hamas in Gaza were blurred, making it difficult, to say the least, to distinguish with any certainty between combatants and civilian non-combatants. Parenthetically and in retrospect, we know that Hamas looted, stole, some if not much of the humanitarian aid that was brought into Gaza. Under these circumstances, the Israeli desire to be in control of the provision of humanitarian aid becomes, in my opinion, understandable. It is clear, however, that the type of blockade announced by Gallant 2 days after October 7 is a clear IHL violation in that it envisioned preventing food and other humanitarian aid from reaching Gaza's civilian, that is to say, non-combatant population. Over the course of the Gaza war, Israel was severely criticized for restricting, for whatever reasons, including certain legitimate reasons, the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. On March 2nd, 2025, for example, after Hamas refused to accept the negotiations framework proposed by U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office announced that, and I quote, "Israel has decided to stop letting goods and supplies into Gaza. We've done that because Hamas steals the supplies and prevents the people from getting them. It uses these supplies to finance a terror machine which is aimed directly at Israel and our civilians, and this we cannot accept." There followed numerous reports by international monitoring bodies that the civilian population of Gaza faced ever-increasing levels of food insecurity. In July, President Trump made what may well have been the understatement of the year when he said that the children in Gaza, quote, "look very hungry," adding that what is happening to these children is, quote, "real starvation stuff." In August, the UN body responsible for measuring hunger crises declared that parts of Gaza were experiencing a famine, a charge that Israeli government officials wrongly rejected. What is incontrovertible is that the deprivation of food during the Gaza war took a severe toll. And it is equally clear that thousands of trucks carrying food and other humanitarian aid did enter Gaza over the course of the war, largely as a result of international pressure on the Israel government and amid claim that Israel was obstructing delivery of this aid. Was there widespread starvation in Gaza? Seemingly not, as evidenced by the fact that the hundreds of thousands of Gazans who returned to their decimated homes after the cessation of hostilities did not appear to have been starved or starving. Were there pockets of starvation, and was there a threat of starvation caused by the continued blockade and the inadequacy of the humanitarian aid being prevented? Definitely. To address briefly one of the more controversial debates of the past several months, did some, not all, Palestinian children in Gaza suffer from starvation? Yes. Did some of these children, whose images were featured in the media, have aggravating pre-existing medical conditions? Again, yes. But this does not absolve anyone of responsibility, especially since individuals, including children, with pre-existing medical conditions are far more susceptible to the impact of hunger or starvation than healthier ones. Where does that leave us? Perhaps with the following insightful observation on Gaza's hunger crisis made by the American-born Israeli author and commentator Yossi Klein Halevi earlier this year, and I quote, "The Israeli government didn't set out to deliberately starve Gaza, but to deny Hamas access to the UN's food distribution system. That was a legitimate goal. But when it became clear that our counter system was disastrously inadequate and that the warnings of approaching starvation might this time be true, why didn't the government change course? Why did it require a world outcry and American pressure to prevent a catastrophe that would have haunted us for years to come? And why were we, the Israeli public, largely silent?" End quote. I would add, why were so many of the rest of us also largely silent? Thank you.
Is my voice audible in the back? Okay. Okay. So first I would like to thank the Jewish Theological Seminary for inviting myself and some of the representatives of our organization to participate in this extremely important symposium over these 2 days. And I also thank Tamara Newman for being the intermediary person and connecting me with the rest of the team of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and Shira Billet for very patiently organizing this panel with one cancellation and one flight cancellation. So I'm going to speak about the problem of global hunger and malnutrition primarily from the perspective of my own work as the founder and chairperson of the organization called Buddhist Global Relief, which we established in 2008. But first, a little bit by way of the background. So I spent 20 years, actually altogether 24 years in Sri Lanka, but continuously in Sri Lanka from 1982 to 2002. And then I returned to the United States in 2002, and the process that led to the creation of Buddhist Global Relief began somewhat as a critique of the way Buddhism was being appropriated and assimilated in the American context. The way Buddhism was adopted by most Americans was primarily as an inward path of, we call, introspection, inner cultivation, mental cultivation, focused primarily around the practice of mindfulness and meditation. So the way I was looking at Buddhism in the United States after I returned, it was in danger of becoming, I describe it sometimes as a little bit like the play toy of a rather affluent, privileged, well-educated elite, losing contact with the concrete, tangible, global suffering that afflicts billions of people around the world. We speak of the aim of Buddhism to be liberation from suffering, but too many people, or Americans who are adopting Buddhism, were taking it as a path to their own personal liberation from suffering and not looking out broadly, panoramically, at the vast dimensions of suffering that afflict so much of the human population. And so in the year 2007, I was invited by one of the North American Buddhist magazines to write an editorial essay. And I wrote, in that essay, I wrote about what I saw as the problem facing North American Buddhism, that it was becoming a bit narcissistic, a bit elitist, a bit detached from concrete realization of the real concrete suffering afflicting so many billions of people. And at the end of my essay, I said that in each historical period, Buddhism finds new ways to unfold its potentials in ways that are precisely linked to that era's distinctive historical conditions. I believe that in our own time, the transcendent truth of the Dharma, the Buddha's teaching, must bend back upon the world and engage human suffering at multiple levels, not in mere contemplation, but in effective action illuminated by its world-transcending goal. I said a special challenge facing Buddhism in our own time is to stand up as an advocate for justice in the world, a voice of conscience for the victims of social, economic, and political injustice who cannot stand up and speak for themselves. I see this as a deeply moral challenge, and I believe it points in the direction that Buddhism should take if it is to share in the Buddha's mission to humanity, the alleviation of suffering. Of course, the Buddha says that the project of eliminating suffering is by eradicating the roots of suffering, which he identifies as the three roots of greed, hatred, and ignorance. And usually in classical Buddhism, we take that to be the inward task of confronting and overcoming our own individual greed, hatred, and delusion. But in today's world, greed, hatred, and delusion exist not only in individual minds, but in systems, social structures, institutions that spread out and envelop the whole world. Greed in the form of, we could say, corporate capitalism, which creates vast disparities of wealth between an extremely small, extremely powerful elite and vast numbers of people who are living in abject poverty. Hatred through militarization, marginalization, the denigration of many communities, and ignorance through campaigns of propaganda in this country that largely induce people to act and to vote against their own true interests. So after my essay was published, I didn't tell anybody about the publication, but some of my friends and students read the magazine, read the essay, and began having some discussions amongst themselves about how they can implement the particular challenge that was presented by that essay. And so we had some initial rounds of discussion, what we can do to meet this challenge of giving a broader dimension to the Buddha's task of confronting and eliminating suffering at a global level. And after some rounds of discussion, we decided to form a Buddhist relief organization with the mission of addressing and overcoming all of the forms of suffering confronting humanity, social, political, and due to natural disasters, with a team of about 10 people and a bank account of about $30,000 to a few generous donations. But it didn't take us long to realize that this project or this mission was just too broad, too general. And so we realized that we had to narrow it down and focus on something more specific and concrete. And so what we chose as our particular mission or project was to combat chronic hunger and malnutrition. And we were inspired by a statement from the Buddha that hunger is the worst kind of illness, and another statement that the gift of food is the gift of life. And so we started off with that mission, and we had to find the challenge of how do we actually put that mission into practice. And one of our board members suggested that we start, this is in 2008, we start with 3 small pilot projects, starting with a bank account, as I said, of about $30,000. We started with 3 small projects, one in Sri Lanka, one in Myanmar, and one in Vietnam. We started a newsletter, and then word about our work started to spread. We started to get more and more donations to the point where now we sponsor about 60 projects around the world in countries ranging from Mongolia through Vietnam, Cambodia, India, Sri Lanka, Cote d'Ivoire, Malawi, Cameroon, Haiti, Peru, Nicaragua, and some projects in the United States. And we decided, as time went on, we developed 4 ways in which we try to fulfill this mission. The initial way we thought to go about it is by providing direct food aid to people afflicted by hunger and malnutrition. But in time, we started to look into the underlying roots of hunger and malnutrition. And the underlying roots, of course, one of the underlying roots is poverty, endemic poverty. And so then we inquired, what can we do to help communities emerge from poverty? And some articles by Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times provided us with an important key, and that is he focused on the subordinate status of girls and women in many traditional cultures as one of the sustaining factors of poverty. And so one of the keys, the ladders to bring communities out from poverty is to promote the education of girls and to enable women to earn more to support their families. And so this gave us clues to 2 ways to combat hunger and malnutrition. One is to support the education of girls. The other is to promote projects that enable women to start right livelihood activities to earn more to support their families. And then also another growing cause of hunger and malnutrition is the industrial model of agriculture, which is accelerating climate change. And so we found that an important tool for combating hunger and malnutrition is to support ecologically sustainable models of agriculture. And that often ties in with women's right livelihood, because in many traditional cultures, the primary cultivators of food are, in fact, women. And so the emphasis of Buddhist Global Relief is not so much on emergency relief operations, but rather what we emphasize is fostering better long-term methods of sustainable food production and distribution designed to ensure the beneficiaries a constant supply of healthy and nutritious food. And so we emphasize what we call promoting food sovereignty rather than food dependency, projects that make people, communities, relatively independent in obtaining sufficient nutritious food. Some of our core values, we made up a list of core values to support and sustain our work. So we begin with the central principle that all life on this planet is interconnected and interdependent, and in particular, the current high standard of living that we enjoy in the West was largely founded upon the labor and resources of those in the East and the South. And so for this reason, we should seek to reciprocate their contribution by helping their descendants in their time of need. And we also draw upon a principle that the Buddha himself taught back in the ancient texts. He said that it's the responsibility of the government to guard and protect all the residents of the land and to take measures to address poverty through state-sponsored deeds of welfare. And so our core values, we list faith, and by faith we mean not specifically adherence to the Buddhist faith, but a conviction in the power of goodness, the conviction that goodness constitutes an objective power that gives meaning and value to our lives. A second core value is compassion. Compassion is defined as the quality of the heart that makes, or the quality that makes our hearts tremble with the suffering of others. Compassion opens us up to the distress rising in the hearts of countless people around the world, especially those who are facing poverty, hunger, and malnutrition. And then to follow the call of compassion, we enter into service to others. And so I just will give a brief overview of several of our most important or major projects to give some idea of the kind of work that Buddhist Global Relief does. And the way we work is we don't have enough people to send to the countries in which we launch our projects. We have a team of about 4 or 5 regular staff members, a board of about 10 members. So what we do is to form partnerships with organizations, primarily grassroots organizations working in the countries in which we implement our projects. So one project is in Cambodia with a partner, it's a US-based partner called Lotus Outreach International. And this project provides the rice to the families of female students in rural Cambodia on condition that the families allow their girls to continue with their education. Because what happens in many traditional families in Cambodia, there are girls and boys in the families. When they reach the teenage girls, the boys can continue their education. The girls are compelled to drop out and start working to support their families. And in Cambodia, many of those girls in the rural areas go into the cities and are drawn into the brothels. Okay. I see, we got the note. I'm so sorry, because there's no clock here. Okay, so we provide rice to the families of the girls on condition that they allow the girls to continue with their education. And many of these girls who have done very well in school then qualify for admission to the university. And in an extension of this project, we provide them with scholarships to continue their education at the university level. Okay, another project provides meals to school children in Jamaica and Haiti. We partner with an organization called the Trees That Feed Foundation that provides breakfast to school students, and the breakfast comes from breadfruit trees which are grown in the country itself. Another program that we have provides vocational training to women in Cameroon. And so this project provides vocational education and training to women and youths through a partner called CC Reed, the Center for Community Regeneration and Development in Cameroon. And at the completion of their training, the graduates receive seed capital and ongoing monitoring so that they can move forward in their careers. Another project we have in Africa is with an organization, a partner organization called Ecology Action. And this project teaches sustainable agriculture. a special method called Grow by Intensive Agriculture to help farmers grow more food using fewer resources. And so this project has been training 2,300 farmers, including 1,400 women, in methods such as compost making, crop management, seed production, seed banking, and food security strategies. So this is just a brief overview of several of our projects, and some of our team members will be presenting more information about our projects in a session later today in one of the workout groups. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so we have a few moments for a second round with each of our presenters, where they'll share something about how they come to the work and a text or more than one from their tradition that inspires their work. There was a handout. I don't know if everyone has one, but we have more copies, so come to the front of the room. And we'll begin with Reverend Phillips.
Thank you. Yeah, I come to this work as a practicing Christian. I'm an ordained minister. I didn't grow up in the church, so I kind of went to faith communities wherever I could go to with friends growing up in San Diego. And I think that was the kind of early seeds for my understanding of pluralism as well, not just civic, but a deeply held religious pluralism. The passage that I shared is actually out of the New Testament, the Christian Bible, written by Paul of Tarsus, St. Paul, to the church at Philippi. And it might be kind of not your normal kind of passage to share, but I'm really drawn to it in a personal way because I think it calls not just for ways to imitate the divine in my tradition through the Christ, through Jesus of Nazareth, but also notions of power and responsibility. I think we have been crippled and traumatized by generation after generation of power over one another, dominions of power. And I really had to think through this when I went into government work too, like that. I think state sanctioned power is a force to be reckoned with, literally. But this passage out of Philippians 2 actually captures what many theologians think is an early folk song or hymn, as you might say. It talks about consolations from love, sharing in the spirit. It talks about humility in terms of regarding others as better than ourselves. That we look not to our own interests, but to the interests of others, like these like touchstones of seeking the common good. And it talks about Christ Jesus, who thought he was in the form, who though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself. Really this downward path. And so I really draw on that in these days of both awe, as a dad, as a neighbor, as a fellow citizen, but also shock and horror around the daily news cycles that we see of immense human suffering that I think we can overcome if we kind of bind together and in my own tradition seek that downward path is of service to others. So my passage was Philippians chapter 2.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can everyone hear from these microphones?
The prohibition in the Bible against cutting down trees, fruit trees, during a siege is clear. It's a prohibition against depriving people of food. At the same time, however, we know that sieges do occur. There are numerous of them mentioned in the Bible, some more gruesome than others. I refer you to the one in 2 Kings, in which There's some gruesome concepts involving Elisha, but in the one that we have from Jeremiah, there's a reference to a siege, and I refer you to the last line. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine had become acute. There was no food left for the common people. A recognition that the siege is not likely, that a famine is not likely to affect the kings. It's not likely to affect the priests. It is likely to affect the common people, the poor. And what I'd like to do, with your permission, is to, rather than I'm not a rabbi, and I don't presume to be one, but I'd like to read a poem that I wrote in the midst of the war, as things were getting worse and worse. And I did so as a son of survivors whose families were largely murdered during the Holocaust, and whose 5.5-year-old brother was murdered during the Holocaust. And so this was written sometimes in, I think, April or so of 2024. Murdered children, emaciated children, must awaken us before it is too late to who we are, to why we are. The starving child in the Warsaw Ghetto, Białystok Ghetto, Będzin Ghetto, was created in the same divine image by the same God, the same Adonai, the same Allah, as the starving child in Gaza City, Khan Yunis, Rafah. The dead child in Gaza City, Khan Yunis, Rafah, is cried over with the same tears by the same God, the same Allah, the same Adonai, as the dead child in Kfar Aza, Nachal Oz, Be'eri. The child, Israeli child, Palestinian child, Jewish child, Muslim child, is innocent, always was, always will be innocent. And it is for the not yet dead child, Palestinian child, Israeli child, Muslim child, Jewish child, that the killing must end, the war must end, the terror must end, the hatred must end. We cannot erase the horrors of October 7th. We cannot erase the images of shrouded infants in the rubble of bombed hospitals. But despite unending anguish, Adonai's anguish, Allah's anguish, our anguish, Israelis and Palestinians, Muslims and Jews must now look into the sunrise to create a beginning of hope, however elusive, if not for themselves, if not for ourselves, then for the child, the Israeli child, the Palestinian child, the Jewish child, the Muslim child.
Okay, the sheet that was handed out has some Buddhist texts that I find inspirational for our work, but I want to speak rather from my own personal experience about what led me to create Buddhist Global Relief and why we specifically focus on the problem of hunger and malnutrition. And this goes back to my own personal experience when I first became a monk in Sri Lanka. This was towards the end of 1972. And during that period, the Sri Lankan government was experimenting with some economic policies. I would consider them foolish economic policies, which led to severe depletions in the food supply available to the people of the country. And in the monastery, we depend upon the offerings of people for our food supply. And so what we were getting at the monastery where I was living, we were getting an adequate supply of rice, which is the red country rice, which is fairly nutritious, but there were very little other types of food to go along with the rice, usually just a watery, dish of lentils and a watery green vegetable, and pretty much that was it, the main meal of the day. And so this went on day after day, month after month, for about a year and a half, to the point where I was actually really experiencing how my body was being deprived of the essential vitamins, nutrients that it required. It was not just a feeling of hunger in the stomach, but I could almost feel like the cells of my body crying out, "We need nutrients. You're not getting the nutrients that you need." And it reached a point where some days I would look at my rubber sandals in the corner of the hut where I was living and wondering whether or not they were edible. Of course they were not. Okay, towards the end of that period, a monk from India came to stay at the same monastery where I was living, and he would go out on alms round with his alms bowl, collecting food from the villages, and come back. And we would meet a few times a week to have some discussions about the Buddha's teachings. And one day I came to his cottage, and he had a banana leaf on the floor with a heap of food on it. And he asked me, he said, "Bhikku Bodhi, have you seen the dogs today?" Because he had the food reserved for the dogs. And when he asked me that question, I actually burst out in tears. And he asked me, "What's wrong with you? Why are you crying?" And I said, "The dogs here are eating better than I am." And then he said, "Well, you come along with me on alms round." And in that way, I started to go on alms round, and we collected enough food, and even excess food, so that we could give to the younger monks in the temple. But that experience of undergoing severe nutrient deficiency over a period of about a year and a half left a very deep impression on me. So when we established Buddhist Global Relief, and we were seeking a more specific mission, the idea occurred to my mind to make the mission addressing the problem of chronic hunger and malnutrition. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of our panelists here and on Zoom for these edifying presentations and sharing personally as well. And we have 5 minutes to open the floor for discussion, so we'll take questions from the audience. And in the meantime, we can just give a round of applause to everybody.
Thank you all very moving, and the clarifications were so very helpful. I have a question for Professor Rosensaft, and it's about, at least in my limited knowledge, and I don't know a lot about law or warfare, but I always made parallels between what's going on with Israel and Gaza with the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, because in both cases we were fighting terrorist organizations, and they weren't officially an army against an army. And so I was wondering, with the many clarifications that you offered us for consideration, is there any exceptions or alternates when you, in a situation like this, when you don't have literally an army against an army? Obviously, it becomes so much more complicated when you're dealing with a terrorist organization. Thank you.
The answer is that you have to sort of make it up as you go along. And that's what happened in Afghanistan, that's what happened here. The impetus, obviously, in waging war is destruction of the enemy. Not necessarily for purposes of cruelty, but for purposes of ending the war. That is always part of the motivation. On the other hand, you do have the need, the obligation to feed, to take care of, to protect civilians. And Unfortunately, we do not have a working international humanitarian system. We have it in theory. We know that it exists on paper. The answer is it doesn't. The UN entities in Gaza failed for whatever reasons. The humanitarian aid that was brought in was largely looted. At one point there was a UN report that 88% of it was looted either by starving people, by hungry people, or by Hamas. So the answer to your question is, in theory, yes. In practice, it depends. In what happened in Gaza, which is the situation I'm most familiar with, is that Israel was in fact forced by international pressure, and in large part by pressure from the United States, to let in increased humanitarian aid. Starvation in Gaza was averted by international pressure. That is the reality. It doesn't mean that Israel intended to starve anyone, but there was still the sense that the pressure of starvation, the pressure of denial of food and humanitarian aid, might get Hamas to give in. Problem was, Hamas used that in order to terrorize their own people. So not a good answer, not a satisfying answer, but that's where we are.
We have about one more moment. I would love if there are questions as well for our other panelists to collect to, and then we can get a moment of response from each person. So I just wanted to ask then, both Reverend Phillips and Venerable Bodhi, like, what do you see as the things that ordinary citizens in this room,
As the
I know it's very hard to hear one another on these mics. What can ordinary citizens be doing in light of the dismantling of USAID and in light of these systemic problems you described? What can people walk away with as a next step or something to do? Obviously, that's a big question, but if there's even a brief charge, and obviously Professor Rosensaft as well. So maybe
I can go
Reverend
first.
Phillips. Yeah, please.
Sure. Yeah. Never underestimate the power of individuals, each one of us, to bind together with our institutions, whether they're congregations or faith-based institutions like Venerable Bodhi's, to really lean in, sign up, contribute, find ways to serve, and possibly even sacrificially give. There are dozens and dozens of incredible organizations that are on the front lines of displaced persons, hunger and famine around the world, and they could use all of our help.
Thank you.
Yeah, so of course, one of the solutions, a partial solution to the problem of chronic hunger and malnutrition around the world is by contributing to organizations, charitable organizations, which provide relief from hunger and malnutrition. Not only Buddhist Global Relief, but there are many larger, more powerful organizations like the World Food Program, Action Against Hunger, Oxfam International, and so forth. But also, I would say that what's extremely essential is to change the political system in this country. Because now we have a government which Adam Phillips mentioned has cut off US aid, decimating the aid system which provided a lifeline to millions of people around the world, and which has been using even the food stamps, the SNAP program, to starve people here in the United States. It's rather shameful 48 million people in this country, even before. It's a shame even that 48 million people in this country should depend upon a SNAP program to acquire sufficient food for their families. So we really need a much more generous and equitable political system which can provide for the well-being of all of the citizens in the country.
Any charge for?
Well, obviously, I agree with both comments and both suggestions. And I'll just give a perhaps not very uplifting reminder that this is nothing new. Whether it was Ukraine in the 1920s and early 1930s in a man-made famine that was really directed by Stalin, or whether it was Biafra in a more recent time, or whether it was in the aftermath of World War II when the concentration camps were liberated and the inmates had been starved and couldn't handle the food, and at Bergen-Belsen, thousands of people died in the weeks after liberation from receiving too much food from the British, who were trying to help, and it couldn't be handled. So I'm saying this not as a downer, but the food deprivation, food inequality has been with us since time immemorial. And if we get governments inclined, and we elect governments inclined to try and address that, we make progress. If not, we have a serious problem. And there's, unfortunately, right now, very little we can do about it, except, of course, to go back to my earlier point that, much as I hate to say it, the real starvation in Gaza was prevented by the very government that otherwise is identified with depriving people of access to food.
On all this note of what we can do and reality checks about complexities, I leave this conversation to be carried forward into the future and for everyone to continue the thoughtful and important work being done here. Thank you so much to our panelists.
Okay, many thanks to all and to you, Dr. Billet. So there is a little bit of a break now. We're ending 5 minutes later, but I'm going to sort of decree that these workshops will start 5 minutes later at 11:35 because there's plenty of time for them and they go into the lunch break. So consider it 11:35. You have in the insert in your program the 4 workshops that are scheduled now. 2 of them are on this level in Seminar Room B and the Presentation Room. When you come out of this auditorium, right across the atrium are those 2 rooms, and there'll be people there to direct you to them. One is about the faith, dignity, and hope on Rikers Island, and the other in the ethics of peace, building dignity across divides. And then there are 2 that you access through the entry lobby. One in the Beit Midrash, Rabbi Shmuel Yanklowitz, who on introspection as a path to empathy and action. That's in the Beit Midrash, and the door is unlocked there, so you can go in where you see the green light, but they'll direct you. You can also take the steps, if you wish, from once you're inside, to the 2nd floor to the Women's League Seminary Synagogue, where you will have more people from Buddhist Global Relief and from American Jewish World Service about shared responsibility and for basic needs. Or you can take the elevator, which will need a swipe, but Eli Mars is there to swipe swipe you into the elevator to the second floor. You had something, Ellie? Dr. Paul Wolpe is in the presentation room. Right. Rabbi Hilly Haber is in seminar room B. Rabbi Shmuel Yanklowitz is in the Beit Midrash on this floor. And Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay, facilitating the Buddhist Global Relief, is in the Women's League Seminary Synagogue. So enjoy the break.